Instead of enjoying the differences between groups and the joyful discovery of new ideas, new traditions, new experiences, we set up borders. This human tendency to set separations, to worship borders, to worship lines that separate us. If those lines get mixed up in business interests, in other words, if somebody's making money from those negative attitudes about those others, then there is serious potential for somebody getting hurt. For example, mix oil money, defense contractors, political power, and differences of religion, mix them all together, and add liberally some serious worry about our borders, and we have an explosive and horrendous mixture. Usually, we don't like to talk about the anger or admit the injustices that our borders create. And a basic human response is to try to return to feeling good about my border by avoiding them or dehumanizing them or denying their history as well. So borders become locations of trouble. The shouting continues, the anger builds. How do we get back to joyful coexistence? How do we return to learning from each other and enjoying our differences without feeling threatened? Well, I would suggest that somebody needs to start demonstrating the value of violating the borders that separate us, those cruel separations. And perhaps by our being willing to violate borders that separate us, we can suggest a different way of existing together. War, of course, is the ultimate expression of resentment across borders, and the horrendous sacrifices that are necessary for warfare require huge efforts to conjure up those bad feelings about them. History teaches us, sadly, that many religious and political leaders often find that their power, their wealth, and their authority is actually strengthened by feeding this mistrust of the others, by advocating strong borders, using words like our way of life, and especially by shouting, our borders are in danger. One particularly effective way to strengthen power is to dehumanize the other and talk about them as if they are people we can never trust. Another effective leadership tactic by those who are hungry for power is to try to make themselves appear to be the leaders of the majority, the normal people, by using the language of infection to dehumanize people within our border. Notice the power of using that language of infection, especially in the Rwandan massacres, right? The minority amongst them were spoken of as if they are infecting our society. Clearly, this kind of language can build until it is used to justify horrendous genocidal violence, the destruction of Muslim Bosnians, Tutsi Rwandans, Jewish Germans, Turkish Armenians, Native Americans. The list sadly goes on in history. Is the creation and maintenance of these border conflicts really so important for us to study as people who seek peace? I would suggest very much so. That we live in a country where virtually every conflict that this nation has engaged in has involved massive expenditures by our government, not just on the weaponry, not just on the hardware of warfare, but massive expenditures on convincing the general population that the conflict is necessary and that the enemy is worthy of only being destroyed. I believe that people of goodwill have deeply important reasons for being suspicious of any attempt to encourage us to dehumanize another human. As the Old Testament frequently reminds the Israelites, remember, you were once slaves in Egypt. In other words, you were once the other in the eyes of a hostile majority. So always be suspicious of the language of hate and separation, the language of building up borders. Now, being a part of a tradition, part of a religious faith, can be deeply rewarding, fulfilling, and meaningful. But what do we do when group loyalties, those innocent borders of membership and participation, start turning into the borders of separation and hatred? Well, as a teacher of the Bible, I would suggest that the Bible has some interesting suggestions for us. I believe that the Bible says we should learn to start running those borders, that we should violate those kind of borders that separate us. Someone has to have the courage to cross the border, to be willing to listen, to overcome the desire to make borders tighter and more secure whenever we feel criticized. Now, in a recent book called Reading the Bible with the Damned, a pastor in Washington, Pastor Bob Ekblad, described what he has learned by working with immigrant and migrant workers in the state of Washington. One image that he used in that book struck me deeply. He said that he had worked a lot with illegal border crossers from Mexico, and he was unprepared for something that he heard about polleros, coyotes. Now, on television, in film, and in newspapers, we are familiar with the image of the coyote. The coyote is the one who helps people cross the borders, usually taking money to do so. And we are used to many, many stories of unscrupulous men and women who exploit the poverty of Latin Americans who are desperate to find work in the United States. And of course, this is often true. There are hundreds of horror stories of bad coyotes mistreating poor immigrants who only want to find a better life. What surprised Pastor Ekblad, however, was the fact that many of the immigrants that he worked with had stories of good coyotes. These were the people who used the money that they were paid to make sure that the people crossing the border were fed, that they were taken care of, that they had safe passage. I was so surprised at Pastor Ekblad saying that some of the people spoke of good coyotes that I started to actually try to find evidence for this myself. My friends, in hardly a very liberal publication known as USA Today, I found the following suggestion. The writer in this article, December 1st, 2003, the writer interviewed many immigrants, and the writer said that migrants don't see them all as the bad guys in the movies. Many call them heroes because they got them and their families across the border. And if you ask them, they will say, thanks to the pollero, I'm in the United States. Thanks to the pollero, my mother and my children, my grandfather are in the United States. So Pastor Ekblad wondered, gosh, is there really such a thing as a good coyote? And then he made a fascinating observation. As a Christian pastor working in the prisons and among migrant workers in Washington, he said it suddenly dawned on him, Jesus is a good coyote. Jesus, he said, asks us to cross borders. For example, as I was thinking about this idea of Jesus as someone in my Christian tradition who might be calling on me to actually violate borders in the name of peace. What an interesting thought.